Is the Bible the Word of God? I'm addressing this question because so many of my most devout followers have allowed themselves to become so attached to the Bible that they are not open to considering any other spiritual teachings. In fact, many of them are not even open to hearing my living word. Obviously, I am not happy with the situation that prevents me from communicating with my own. I am aware that many of these Christians are not likely to read this book. Yet I desire to address the question. I am Jesus Christ, and I am an ascended being. Everything that ever took place on earth has been recorded, and I have full access to those records. When I look at the history of the Bible, I can truly say that the Bible is the most complex literary work on this planet. The origins of the Bible go so far back that both Orthodox Christians and materialistic scientists would be reluctant to accept it. The Old Testament springs from an ancient oral tradition that has been told and retold over countless generations. I'm sure you can see the possibility that during such a long process some things might have been lost, some things might have been distorted, and some things might have been added. Parts of the Old Testament did indeed originate as the result of divine inspiration. Many things have been added to the original delivery, and these additions were also the Word of God through divine inspiration. Therefore, parts of the Old Testament are indeed divine inspiration. However, during its long history, the Old Testament has been changed by people who did not respect the Word of God and who had no compunctions about adding, subtracting, and distorting to suit their purposes. Therefore, the best one can say about the Old Testament is that it does indeed contain fragments of the Word of God, but that much of it is no longer the pure Word of God. At the same time, one must also recognize that some parts of the Old Testament were never meant to be the Word of God. They were simply historical records telling the story of a certain group of people in an attempt to preserve those records for posterity. As for the New Testament, I have already told you the reasons I did not personally organize the writing down of my teachings. I did not want to bring forth an outer doctrine because I knew that it would inevitably be distorted. And why would I bring forth an official outer doctrine when I was still delivering the living word? Furthermore, I have tried to help you see that it was my intention to keep delivering that living word indefinitely. Therefore, I desire you to recognize that when the original gospel writers wrote down the New Testament, they did not attempt to provide a complete account of my life or my teachings. Their aim was to preserve a historical record of some of the highlights of my life so that the growing Christian movement would not have disputes about what I did or said. This was a noble goal, but once again I must tell you that had people been willing, they could have received that information directly from me. I must also tell you that the only way to resolve disputes among different groups of Christians is through the living word and the Christ consciousness. When you look at the many contemporary Christian sects who each claim to have the correct interpretation of the scriptures that were delivered 2,000 years ago, I am sure you will agree that no written record could possibly resolve the disputes among Christians. The death consciousness can create conflict where no conflict exists, and you can never resolve that conflict by using the death consciousness itself. Therefore, no written record, regardless of how authoritative it might seem, could ever resolve the disputes and differences between people who are enveloped in the death consciousness. I want you to understand that the original gospel writers did indeed have a certain measure of Christhood, and that much of what they wrote was inspired writing. Obviously, the book of Revelation was brought forth through direct inspiration. Therefore, it is not incorrect to say that the New Testament in its original form was the Word of God. However, you need to understand what is meant by the expression the Word of God. What is the Word of God? It is not impossible for God to speak His words directly in this world. Nothing is impossible to God. A representative of God did indeed speak the words, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." However, I must tell you that these are rare occurrences. Most of the time, God delivers the living word through an individual human being who raises his or her consciousness to the level of the Christ consciousness. Therefore, that person becomes the open door through which the living word can enter this world. I was such an open door, and so were my apostles and many other people both before and after my coming. You must also understand that when God delivers the living word through a person, that word becomes individualized. In its purest sense, the Word of God is the Christ consciousness. I have already told you that the universal Christ consciousness cannot enter this world in its purest form. To enter this world, the universal Christ consciousness must be individualized. I want you to understand that the individualization of the Christ consciousness, or the Word of God, is not necessarily a degradation of that Word. However, the individualization of the Word will inevitably be affected by the mind of the individual who serves as the open door. I have already told you that my teachings are in many ways affected by my personality. I desire you to understand that the Word of God can be delivered in many different ways that are all valid and that all pay homage to the universal truth from which they came. Therefore, when I say that my teachings were the Word of God, I want you to understand that it was one version of the Word of God and not the only possible version of the Word of God. I want you to avoid any kind of fanaticism concerning the Scriptures. I also want you to recognize that throughout history, there have been instances in which a person was selected to deliver the Word of God, but that person was not able to be a completely pure instrument. Therefore, you can find spiritual teachings on this planet that were inspired by the Ascended Masters yet still contain some false ideas or concepts. I will not point the finger at any particular teaching. I simply desire you to understand that even though a teaching is inspired from above, it is possible that some of the original message can be lost in the process of bringing it into the material world. In all fairness, I must tell you that being the instrument for the delivery of the Word of God is not an easy process. Addition and subtraction. I hope you will see that the New Testament in its original form was to a large degree inspired by God, and therefore it is not incorrect to say that it is the Word of God, as long as one understands what I have stated above. We now need to consider what has happened to the original Gospels in the almost 2,000 years that have passed since they were brought into this world. Once again, I have access to the full historical records, and nothing is hidden to me. As much as it might pain you, I must tell you that the Gospels you have today are but fragments of what was originally brought forth. Therefore, they simply do not contain the fullness of what I want you to know about me, about my life, and about my teachings. I know many Christians will be reluctant to accept this fact, but you ought to read the Scriptures that you claim are the Word of God. The Scriptures themselves say that if all I did and said should be written down, the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Is that not a clear indication that even the original Scriptures did not contain the fullness of my message? I must tell you that I completely fail to understand how so many Christians can ignore this obvious truth. How could they possibly reason that I, Jesus Christ, do not have any more to tell them about my Father's kingdom than what is recorded in the present-day Gospels. To me, this is astonishing. What is even harder for me to understand is that so many Christians cling to the written scriptures and cling to a particular interpretation of those scriptures, completely closing their minds and hearts to my living word, which I have been delivering almost continually for the past 2,000 years through many different sources. I must tell you that progressive, ongoing revelation is my true desire. What do you think I meant when I said I will be with you always? Why do you think I appeared to my disciples after my resurrection? I never intended to leave you alone in a dark world where all you had as a guiding rod was a set of written scriptures that provided a fragmentary account of my life and teachings. I desired to continue to give you comfort and understanding through the living word of God which I am. That is why I said, I have yet many things to say unto you, but you cannot bear them now. Why do those who consider themselves to be my followers reject my living word? The delivery of the living word. For the past 2,000 years, I have delivered my living word through various people who had the courage to open their hearts and minds to me. Some of them did indeed work within the context of the Orthodox Christian churches. Yet in many cases, the fanaticism of the Orthodox Church forced me to go outside of that church in order to bring forth another piece of my ongoing revelation. This tendency has continued until the present day, and the book you are holding in your hand is only one in a long series of these deliveries from me. The New Testament does not represent the be-all and end-all of the delivery of my word. You will find that word in many other sources. Likewise, this book is not meant to be seen as the be-all and end-all of the delivery of my word. It is part of a tradition that goes all the way back to when I first appeared to my disciples after my resurrection. It is part of a tradition where the living Master, Jesus Christ, delivers the living word to those who dare to be his living disciples. Choose life. Choose the living word of Christ over the word of an orthodox doctrine filled with dead men's bones. The scriptures are incomplete. I desire you to realize and accept that the written scriptures you have today leave much to be desired. Many things have been subtracted from them for the political reasons, not the least of which is the teaching on reincarnation. Other things have been added to them, once again for political reasons. Furthermore, many things have been lost to honest mistakes in translations and transcriptions. I am not thereby saying that the current scriptures do not have value. They do indeed have value, and they do indeed contain keys that some live streams have used to discover my inner teachings. Yet for most people, the current scriptures simply cannot serve as a stepping stone to the discovery of my inner teachings. Therefore, I want you to know that I, Jesus Christ, do not want you to confine your studies to the current scriptures. I want you to open your mind and heart and seek truth wherever it can be found. Do not limit God's ability to bring truth into this world. Do not limit God's ability to bring truth into your heart and mind, even through an unexpected source. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels in disguise. The truth of God often appears in disguise. Do not reject the truth simply because you do not like its outer appearance. Those who want the truth of God must look beyond all appearances to the inner truth that transcends this world. The Law and the Prophets. I would like to explain the true meaning behind the statement that I came to fulfill the law and the prophets. I am aware that some Christians have used the statement to reason that the fulfillment of the tradition of the prophets, meaning the delivery of the Word of God through an individual human being, came to an end with my ministry. I can understand why people would draw this conclusion, and I do not condemn anyone for believing this idea, yet I must tell you that the idea is incorrect. When I refer to the law and the prophets, I refer to a specific period, a specific spiritual cycle in Earth's history. That spiritual cycle began at the time of Abraham. The spiritual teaching that served as a guiding rod for that cycle was the law of Moses. This law was given with the hope that by applying the law, people would raise their consciousness. At the end of the spiritual cycle, people would be ready to receive a higher law. Therefore, the fulfillment of the cycle that I refer to as the law and the prophets was the bringing forth of the higher law that I did indeed bring forth in the Sermon on the Mount and other teachings. In other words, by fulfilling the law and the prophets, I initiated the next 2,000-year cycle. This did not mean that I came to bring an end to the delivery of the living Word of God. The delivery of the living Word of God has been happening for as long as there have been people on this planet. As long as people are willing to raise their consciousness so that they can be the open door for the delivery of that Word, the delivery of the living Word of God will continue indefinitely. I had no intention whatsoever of putting a stop to the delivery of the living Word. I think the proof should be in the very fact that I continued to appear to my disciples after my resurrection. I hope these words will not fall on deaf ears and that my followers, those who claim to be Christians, will open their minds and hearts to the living Word of God as it is being delivered today and will be delivered in the future. As I said to Saul on the road to Damascus, I now say to you, stop kicking against the pricks.